Okay. If we can, if you're sitting in the back, please move forward so that we can get started. It'll come up. Okay, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Welcome everyone to a special event tonight. We're calling it an enrichment night because, as you know, our speaker from many times before, Candace Lukasik, is always coming with an academic background to speak to us about her research. And so we welcome Candace today. We're so blessed to have her with us. She actually was with us all day today. There was a funeral earlier for a wonderful man by the name of Megadateya, who was a great bridge between our Egyptian heritage in Coptic Orthodoxy and or just Egypt at large, Coptic Orthodoxy, Islam, and bridging it with us here, first and second generation Americans that have parents that have migrated here from Egypt way back when. And so it'll be nice today to also benefit from Candace's talk, which is exploring migration for Coptic Orthodox Christians. I know I butchered the title just now. Let me repeat it.
Well, I have another title, but that's okay.
Okay, we'll give both titles. Yeah. Exploring Effects of Migration on Coptic Orthodox Christians and Paradoxes of Migration, Race in the Coptic Diaspora. Candace, we're so happy you're with us today. If you guys know, Candace is all over the place. She lived 16 months in Upper Egypt. Many of us have never been to Egypt. Candace, and I'm going to kind of go into your personal life a little bit. Candace's background is Polish, and then she actually converted into the Coptic Orthodox Church because of her life in Egypt, and she did 16 months research for her. She's currently a PhD candidate, and her dissertation is in anthropology.
Okay.
Yes, and she's now actually doing it through Berkeley in California. So we're blessed to have Candace with us. Please welcome Candace. God bless you.
Okay, wait, how do I do this situation? Also, is anybody going to record this? I'd like
Yes,
to.
it's streaming.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
I didn't see where the stream was happening. Oh, okay, all right. You have to turn it on. Okay. I need to like log out of Facebook then, so it doesn't continue to come up.
No, it's fine. Justin, can you come from?
Come up. Okay.
Just maximize.
Okay, cool. What am I doing? Okay. Got it. Okay. All right. I'm like really excited to be here. Like, thanks for coming out in the middle of whatever's happening outside. Uh, I wanted to. This is actually a nerve-wracking presentation for me, because it has always been like a topic that I felt like I had to tiptoe around, particularly like in the United States and asking these questions. But I didn't actually come into this project, my dissertation, focusing on race. But it's something that became very important after collecting all my data and kind of looking through it. So today I want to talk a little bit about some of the paradoxes of migration and thinking about race, like within the Coptic community. And I'm talking about specifically those that are like ethnically Coptic, like Egyptian, not weird white converts like myself. So I wanted to present today like through a number of stories. So I'm going to tell you a bunch of stories that came about during my field work, which I'll talk about in a little bit, the details of it. And I wanted us to kind of think about some of the paradoxes of being Coptic in the United States, particularly over the past, let's say, 20 years. So I'm going to start with a very interesting story that took place in January of, a very sad story that took place in January of 2019. So this is the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. I'm not sure if anybody has visited or anything else, but there's a lot of cops that seem to love and go see some of the stolen artifacts from their people at this museum. This museum is funded by the Green family, particularly Steve Green, who is the CEO of Hobby Lobby. And the reason that that's also very important is because a lot of the artifacts, and this is an important note, a lot of the artifacts at this museum, both Coptic and from Iraq, have been in some kind of controversy over the past few years because they were bought on the black market. So that being said, I want to tell you a story about this man named Romani Melekhetta. So this man is a Coptic asylum seeker. And in January of 2019, he was going to join his church group at the Museum of the Bible. And he went a little bit later and was waiting for a fellow recent immigrant friend on the kind of museum benches outside. And so he's waiting there, and somebody approaches him from the security and is like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm waiting for a friend. What's up? And she's like, okay, who's your friend? Where is he? And he was a little bit flustered. He's like, I'm waiting for him. Is there a problem? So Romani grows very nervous, right? And he's like, okay, I'm getting out of this situation. I'm just going to go into the museum. So he goes in the museum, catches up with the church group, which is in the cafeteria, and the cafeteria's name is Milk and Honey. So he's sitting in Milk and Honey with his church group, and the security approach him again, and they're like, "Sir, can you come with us?" And he's like, "What's up?" He feels very embarrassed at this point, right? And they take him into a private room and proceed to interrogate him for 25 minutes. And they're asking him about his friend, where his friend is from, what is your church? I've never heard of the Coptic church before. What are, all of these very, very specific details, okay? So Romani, sits through this for 25 minutes, and then he leaves. and obviously very concerned. He's an asylum seeker after all, right? He doesn't have his green card yet, and so he's very nervous about this incident. But he leaves the museum, and some days later, he finds out that the FBI went to his landlord and started asking questions. It turns out that the Museum of the Bible referred Romani's case to the FBI under like counterterrorism files. So Romani had his life invaded by the FBI, not only at his place of work, friends, his landlord, all these people were questioned. And so obviously Romani was very scared that he was going to lose his status as an asylum seeker, and that would jeopardize his green card application. And so he filed a case against the Museum of the Bible. And through this case, we get a number of insights into what the museum staff were thinking when they decided to do this. So one of the things that comes about in the deposition and the details of the case, which is available online, Romani Madacheta is a real person, and the reason I'm using his real name is because this is a case that was publicized in the news. And in the deposition, the museum staff talk about the fact that when they looked at his ID, which Romani, generously gave them, they noticed that he had 3 names, Romani Madacheta, and they said that the way in which these 3 names were together indicated that he might be a Muslim, right? That this was not like this normal standard Western way of calling yourself, of naming yourself, right? Not only that, but Romani also had a beard. And the museum staff said that he looked suspicious. And that's why they proceeded to refer him to the FBI, which is a very serious matter, right? And this is some of the quotes from the deposition. One of the managerial staff said that, he had a brown complexion and a beard, quote unquote. And Romani said to an interviewer that he was so upset because these people would never be able to comprehend that there is a Christian person who doesn't look like them. So, and so I start off with this because this seems, like a typical case in a post 9/11 world for where there are a number of people who are identified as the Muslim, or even Muslims that are identified as the Muslim terrorist, right? But what is unique about this case is that Romani is a Coptic Christian, right? And not because he's a Coptic Christian, no. Particularly over the past 10 years, there has been additional focus on saving Middle Eastern Christians by the US government, right? Especially under the Trump administration. And what's so ironic about this happening at the Museum of the Bible is that American evangelicals have been at the forefront of this movement to save the persecuted body. So not only is the US government participating in these kind of efforts, but even from the end of the Cold War, so from 1989, 1990, American evangelicals and evangelicals around the world started to think about persecuted peoples, persecuted Christians in particular. And they identified those in this thing they called the 1040 window, which 1040 window means basically North Africa and the Middle East, right? We're talking about latitude and longitude. And so Christians like the Copts, Syrians, Iraqis, but the Copts in particular, became the kind of centerpieces of legislation. For example, in 1996, when the US government passed the International Religious Freedom Act, there were many Copts that were engaged in those discussions. And so what's unique about this is that while at the same time that Copts are revered, right, in this particular kind of coming together of geopolitical interests, right? That the U.S. government is engaged in different wars in the Middle East and is taking up a renewed effort to save Middle Eastern Christians, like the British and the French did before them. This coincides with the fact that you have many of these Copts that are the focus of saving for U.S. government policy being discriminated against in the United States. They're caught up within these kind of post 9/11 war on terror tactics, right? And so I want us to think about this very paradoxical positionality that Copts and other Middle Eastern Christians in the United States face, right? That they are Christian, and there seems to be some sort of kinship with other Christians, like this very unique photo between Billy Graham, one of the most famous American evangelicals, and Pope Kyrillos himself. And in a way, this was a very poignant photo, right? Because you have Billy Graham bending to Pope Kyrillos. And in many ways, when Billy Graham passed away 2 years ago now, and Copts were sharing this photo, right, as almost kind of unconsciously as a way of that Coptic Orthodoxy has succeeded even over those Protestant missionaries that tried to change us all that time ago. In a way, this photo is very poignant today, where we think about the paradoxes that Copts, both men and women, and I would like to hear from the women here tonight in experiences that they've had in the United States, how Copts are treated in their everyday lives vis-a-vis the kind of broader political framings of Middle Eastern Christians, and Copts in particular, as kind of symbols for the evils of Middle Eastern governments or Islam or whatever else. So I want us to think about that today. Think about how this new kind of political configuration of today mixes with Coptic collective memory and persecution under Byzantine rule, subsequent Islamic regimes, right? How do these two kind of things come together in the diaspora? So once the kind of targets of colonial missionaries, the Copts, are now, in many ways, Christian kin in their Coptic suffering for American evangelicals and others, including not just American evangelicals, but including somebody like Pope Francis, who only a couple years ago, after the 21 were murdered in Libya, talked about an ecumenism of blood, right? The appropriation of Coptic martyrs for kind of Western Christianity's preservation, right? So I want us to think about this paradox today, and I think that maybe Abuna knows this photo a little well, but it's interesting that you have, some Catholic priests that are also getting the Coptic tattoo in solidarity. I know some Protestants, actually, that have also gotten it. And the ways in which even the Coptic icon of the 21 martyrs of Libya is shared, like, amongst Protestant circles online, right? There's also online debates about how Copts are heretical, and how do we reconcile their heresy with our admiration for their suffering, right? Can talk about that in Q&A or whenever else. So I have two questions for everybody today that I want to focus on. So kind of giving this as like a broader framing for thinking about what are the paradoxes of being Coptic in post 9/11 America. One, in light of 9/11 and the war on terror, how do Copts reimagine Islam and experience Egypt, the homeland, differently, right? We are not, we're not in Egypt here. We're in New York, right? A lot of terrible memories of what happened on 9/11 happened here. And so how does that experience measure up with Coptic collective memory of historical suffering, right? And the second So that's more of kind of how do we think of ourselves, or how do Copts think of themselves? And the second being, how do Copts contend with post 9/11 securitization and racialization in their everyday lives? And it is this second question that I'm going to kind of go through some stories from my research to kind of elaborate upon. Which I just want to note, all of the stories are of men. So I would love to hear some responses from the ladies here tonight. So I just wanted to kind of give an overview of like where I did my research and where some of these stories are coming from. So I did research all over the United States. Like I went to Los Angeles, Nashville, the Bay Area, actually throughout the South. But as some of you know, like I did my research between the New York, New Jersey area, St. George and St. Shenouda being my favorite and what I consider to be my home church. And Bahgora, which is a village near Nega Hamedi in Upper Egypt. Bahgora has many Copts that apply to the green card lottery and also apply for asylum. They come to the United States, apply for asylum. And so it is an example of many villages throughout Upper Egypt who, since the revolution, have seen a kind of a stark difference in their population. Because many people are leaving. Not only because of political upheaval, but because of socioeconomic despair for many people. I mean, for both Copts and Muslims in Egypt. But obviously, as a minority community, Copts experience that even more starkly. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about church construction and mosque construction in the United States. So, as many of you know, being Copts or some either born in Egypt or born in the United States, but hearing stories or keeping up with news in Egypt, church construction's pretty tough, right? It's pretty tough in Egypt. And till now, even though there was a law that was passed in 2016 to unify like church construction, to kind of make church construction easier, it's still very hard. Okay. There's a lot of discrimination that takes place. But what do those memories and contested presence, how does that influence how Copts see mosque construction in the United States, right? So I can kind of specify the location of this because it's hard to without discussing that. But as many of you know, that I'm pretty sure there is one now, but as of my fieldwork in 2016, 2017, there was no mosque in Bayonne, New Jersey, right? And there was an initiative to build the first mosque in Bayonne for the Muslim community there. At the time, actually since 2011, there's been 2 Coptic churches in Bayonne. And the city council approved the second one, I think, in 2011. I could be wrong there, but I'm pretty sure it's 2011. And so when this idea for the Bayonne Mosque came up, there was a little bit of pushback from the community, like white members of the community, and as well as some Coptic members of the community that didn't want to see this mosque go up. And so I spoke with somebody who's from Bayonne and knew this case well. There were protests in front of the site, with signs saying, stop the mosque, remember 9/11, a bunch of, typical things that probably we have seen in the news. And some Copts participated in those protests, right? And this is not the only case. Bayonne is not the only case. There's also been issues in Staten Island as well for building certain mosques, and there's also been kind of Coptic protests to that. And so, speaking with somebody about the Bayonne case, this person said the following. This man said the following: "Look, if you are Coptic, you're going to protest Islam. When you've seen and gone through the harassment, the persecution in Egypt and everything, can you blame them?" This person, born and raised actually in Bayonne, said this, and I want us to kind of think about the ways in which we understand kind of collective memory that our parents, passed down to us, or your parents passed down to you, and the ways in which like that intersects with what's actually happening here now. How do we see Islam? How do you see Islam differently as a Copt vis-a-vis other people, right, that are not Coptic? So this also interestingly comes into play. These sectarian dynamics from Egypt come into play in church construction in the United States as well, between issues between Muslims and Christians kind of get transposed onto like a U.S. geography. So in some church in the United States, they wanted to expand, and there was an issue in buying up like some of the land. They bought up all of these pieces of the land, except one plot that for some reason wasn't available for sale. And so during a church meeting about this, the priest, was showing kind of different images of what the church would look like and some of the issues that they were still having, and where can we go from here? And he mentioned, there's this little plot of land that we're not able to get. It's an issue. The person that owns it, هو مصري بس غير مسيحي. مش هقول أكتر من كده. Right? He's Christian. He's Egyptian, but not Christian. I'm not going to say more than that. And then there was just kind of a laugh from the audience. And I asked the priest after. I was like, what was that all about? What's going on there? And he said the following. It's like he simply will not sell this to us. What would that look like? A Muslim Egyptian selling a piece of land in the United States for the purpose of building a church? How would this news be received in Egypt by Muslims there? So not only are we in the first kind of story talking about the ways in which like this, collective memory from Egypt influences how Copts participate in politics in the U.S., but there's also a way in which even church construction in the U.S. is framed by an Egyptian landscape, right? An Egyptian eye is always on it. Whether that's true or not, it may be true, maybe not. But there's always that concern. How will this affect Christian-Muslim relations there, right? And, well, one of the things that I forgot to mention is that in the midst of, many incidents of violence against Copts after 9/11, like one of the first people murdered in hate crimes after 9/11 was a Coptic man in San Gabriel, California, shot to death in his grocery store by two white assailants. And it became very clear that there was a way in which that Copts needed to distance themselves from Muslims in many ways to not only save themselves, but to have normal everyday lives, right? To not be in fear of these kind of racial structures after 9/11 grabbing onto them and possibly killing them, right? And so when we think about even these two cases that are in a post 9/11 world, we also have to think about the ways in which like 9/11 frames a lot of these understandings too, right? So it's also the Egyptian context, but it's also the post 9/11 context too. So I'm sure that, I don't know if anybody's been to Coptic protests in the United States here or not. Usually the people that I go with are a little bit older than you guys. But when you go to some of these protests, there are a lot of signs that are in Arabic, but a lot of them are in English. And so, who are the English signs for, right? Who is the audience? Who do they want? Who do the Coptic protesters want to attract? And so when you see like some of these signs, so for example, there's, it's kind of a little dark, but there's one here that says, never forget 9/11, Al-Qaeda and the MB, the Muslim Brotherhood, are one. We don't negotiate with terrorists, we finance them. And then over here, it says Coptic children are forced to leave their families and convert to Islam because the law says Muslims are better than Christians, I think that says. Okay. So there's a lot going on here, right? In both of these, there's a lot going on here. One, there's a way in which, like, at this Coptic protest, right? And this is in the lead up. I believe that this was from a few years ago. This is in the lead up to declaring the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. So this was in the past, like, few years. When you think about, like, the way in which not only 9/11 is in this poster, Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, and you might say, like, well, yeah, obviously, they're all connected. But there's an Egyptian framing to this story, right? Because in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood has not only been like a boogeyman for the government, particularly especially since 1952, but they have also targeted Copts, right? A vulnerable population, one in which that, Copts have been kind of targets of the state for protection. And so Copts have become state targets in many ways, and their churches have become state targets. They're placed in the middle. But in the U.S. context, how do these signs get taken up by some rather right-wing nefarious figures that don't necessarily care about the specificities of the Egyptian context, right? How are these signs read? The English ones in particular. And I think I have a couple of other ones later too. So let me give some more examples, some more stories about post 9/11 racialization and how this has affected. And again, sorry ladies, love to hear your stories. Mainly Coptic men that I've interviewed and engaged with. So the first story takes place after 9/11. It's the evening of 9/11 in New York, and obviously for anybody who experienced that in New York or New Jersey, obviously a very confusing and sorrowful time that day. I mean, that day and the days following what happened. So this guy, goes to a local 7-Eleven in New Jersey, and with some other Coptic guys, obviously, just some Coptic guys hanging out with Coptic guys. And they go to the 7-Eleven, and like they're hungry, so they just are picking up something to eat at the 7-Eleven. Very excellent choice, guys. So they're hanging out outside, and a van pulls up, and a couple of guys, this person that explained the story to me, described as Hispanic looking, come up and say the following. They said to us, you bleeping terrorists, look what you did. We're going to get you. And then he says, after 9/11, you felt like you were a target and it wasn't your fault. And he explained during this incident that not only did these people say this, but they actively got out of the van and were about to physically assault this person and their friends, and they had to literally escape. And so in this person's retelling of that story, they're like, but it wasn't, we weren't the people that did this, right? We weren't the people, like, You're attacking the wrong folk. So let me give you another story, an even more intense one and very tragic. Somewhere in the United States, a man owned a gas station, and this Coptic man, owned a gas station and had a very successful business. Very successful business. Him and his family were living the American dream. Then one day, an FBI agent came to the gas station after 9/11 and said, we have reason to believe that there might have had a terrorist working here. And we need to shut down the gas station immediately. So the FBI, in having a warrant, hunkered down the gas station, took everything, and this news spread throughout the community. A community in which this man and his family established very close relations, were the American dream within that community, and the community was predominantly white, and many viewed them as just family, right? After the FBI came, this family was not only the target of threats, daily death threats, by members of their own community, but eventually their house was burned down by somebody, and the local police did not do anything to investigate. And so at the time, the person that I spoke with, the brother, or the son of the gas station owner, he explained what kind of torture he was put through in school. Daily beatings from classmates. He was followed by FBI agents home every day. People from the community would drive by while he and his sister walked home, and he explained that one time somebody threw a huge liquor bottle at them and hitting his sister. He experienced a number of, as I said, not only beatings in school, but after school. And the family feared for their lives, especially after the arson attack. And he said the following to me, the son, that it made me feel weird to say out loud, but I always thought to myself during the ordeal, I'm not a Muslim, I'm a Christian. I felt like I was putting them down to say, hey, look, I'm the good guy. I felt like we had to do anything to defend ourselves. So, I mean, this case is not the only case in which cops have been referred to the FBI. I mean, we just saw in January 2019 that there was a Coptic asylum seeker who was referred to the FBI for being identified as suspicious as a possible terrorist. And at the end of this case, the FBI said, oh, sorry, mistaken identity. The person that worked for you had nothing to do with any terrorist activity. Sorry. And then incidents continued even after that revelation from the FBI. So obviously a horrifying experience for this family, but it's not a unique experience, quite frankly. So that was a very intense story. A less intense but still very troubling way in which cops and other Middle Eastern Christians were also racialized into the figure of the kind of Muslim terrorist after 9/11 is in airport security checks. So I don't know if any gentlemen here, or maybe even some ladies, but I'm going to assume the gentlemen maybe that have beards. Okay, so maybe it's just Justin over here. Or even priests going through security checks. I can only imagine what Abuna has had to endure sometimes. Oh, okay, that's good. Well, there's a couple, after this story, I'll say there's been a couple of incidents where priests have also been racially profiled, even though they have a cross on around their necks, which has led to, in many dioceses throughout the United States, changes in priestly garb after 9/11, which I found very interesting. Not only people telling me that, but other priests confirming that in other dioceses. But that's neither here nor there. So, airport security, right? Many Middle Eastern men and Muslim women, let's say, especially those that wear the hijab or are veiled, have experienced this kind of form of racialization or discrimination. And so one person I spoke with, this is from like kind of one of the earliest immigrants to the United States. He wrote something after 9/11 when his nephew was being targeted by airport security over and over and over again. He just grew very frustrated with us. And so he said the following. Actually, this was not even just to me. This was actually an official kind of speech that this person gave at a conference after 9/11. So he says, quote, "The tendency is for security agents and the general population to lump us in with others from the Middle East and view us with suspicion. Unfortunately, this has led to some horrific abuses. What people fail to understand is that Middle Eastern Christians do not victimize people. In reality, for centuries, we have been experiencing terror at the hands of Muslim extremists that the Western world has only begun to know in recent years. Middle Eastern Christians have been placed in a difficult situation. According to Muslim extremists' narrow interpretation of Islam, we are infidels that deserve to die. On the other hand, our fellow Americans often view us with suspicion after hearing our names and seeing our complexion. Kind of rings true with the Romani case. Sadly, this puts us on both sides of the fence. We are identified with the terrorists and the terrorized, the criminals and the victims." And so, I mean, I think that this person, states this paradox very explicitly, right? And it's not one that's easily solved because it's not the problem of cops, it's the problem of white America, right? The ways in which white America, and what I mean by white America is those that have been assimilated into the white experience in the United States, right? Because at one point in time, Irish, Polish people like myself were not considered to be white, right? Even throughout Europe today, like especially in the UK, Polish immigrants are not considered to be white, and they are discriminated against. So there's a way in which whiteness molds to particular eras. So I'll give you kind of a couple history examples in the U.S. context. So Syrian and Lebanese started coming to the United States in the late 19th century, okay? And obviously when they came here, different world, a lot of exclusionary immigrant policies, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, various exclusionary acts for Asian immigrants to the U.S. And the way in which you were able to be naturalized was if you were white, right? And so what many Middle Eastern Christian immigrants did, particularly the Syrian and Lebanese, was to say, look, I am white because I am Christian. My proximity to Europe, right? There was a way in which even anthropologists at Columbia University, Franz Boas, for example, made the case for an Armenian immigrant who was trying to get naturalization, and he argued, well, the Armenians, they preserve some aspects of European civilization. They're closer to the Europeans than they are to the Turks. And that was a way in which that person was able to get naturalization. So there's a way that Middle Eastern Christians have had to prove their proximity to the preservation of Western civilization and culture, European, at that point in time, European civilization and culture. That was a way into them attaining kind of legal naturalization and cultural assimilation in one way or another. And it is only, this is, I think, in 1944, when an Arab Yemeni man in Detroit was filing and trying to get naturalization, because even until that time, it was very hard to become a U.S. citizen, right? Like, it was based on race, okay? And he had to make the argument that says, look, you know, I have a proximity to the Christians in my region. Muslims and Christians live together. So because of that proximity, I am closer to whiteness. So his religion had to be eliminated from the categorization in order for him to be considered white, right? So if we think about those logics in the U.S. context, there's a way that Middle Eastern identities have had to adapt to new kind of systems once they come to the U.S. And so, you know, this changes after 1965. And for many of you, your parents came to the United States after 1965. After all of these quotas and exclusionary acts were lifted, and I'm assuming many of your parents probably came in the late 60s, early 70s, like when these kind of new measures came into effect and everybody started to come to places like Los Angeles or the New York, New Jersey area, right? Or Canada, Toronto, let's not leave them out. Different reasons there. But even from the 1960s, when you have different immigrant communities coming, there are new measures by which your whiteness was kind of leveled up, right? It wasn't necessarily a legal procedure, but it was a cultural procedure. How were you able to assimilate into white society? How many, maybe some of your parents or some people you know, changed their names to appear more white? Different clothing styles, different the ways in which you spoke or learned or didn't learn Arabic growing up. There were different strategies by which in post-1965 America that immigrants had to assimilate in certain ways, depending also on where you were. New York might be different than LA, might be different than Nashville, Tennessee now. So that being said, I want to go back to some protest signs to think about what they mean. So getting back to the present day, post 9/11 America, when we see some of these signs, and these are in English, what are the ways in which they are received by their audience in the U.S.? By the people walking by in the street, in the streets of New York, maybe they don't even understand what's going on most of the time, or by, you know, these pictures shared on social media accounts or in the newspaper, right, as news items. So when we think about kind of, you know, Coptic efforts to help their brethren back in Egypt, and the ways in which, like, their audiences are very much, a lot of the time, kind of white Western political audiences that read these signs very differently, especially in a post 9/11 world, you know, how do we think that this is received, right? Thinking about Christian genocide, even kind of that terminology is also tied up in some kind of white supremacist organizations. Just, I mean, that's very true. Islamic Jihad kidnaps and rapes Christian female children in Egypt, right? I mean, these are it's not to downplay the situations that these people care about and are concerned about in Egypt, but it's to say, how are these signs interpreted in the U.S. by non-Egyptian audiences, right? When you have certain kind of right-wing organizations reading these signs differently than what their intended audiences or intended political actions are. So just some concluding questions, because I think I've talked too much. So how are Coptic experiences of Islam weaponized within U.S. politics? So like these signs, like it's not to say, that there isn't kidnapping happening, that there maybe isn't that there maybe isn't even rape happening. Obviously there's a lot of context and layers to these experiences, right? When we see the sign in the lower left-hand corner, we demand freedom for Copts who have been in chains for 1,445 years. Obviously, this person is talking about 641 AD with the Islamic conquest of Egypt. So, Copts obviously read these signs maybe differently. But what about non-Copts, right? Second question is, particularly for the women in the audience, how do Coptic women understand race in the U.S.? And what are the ways that you have tried to assimilate into white American culture? And my final question, how does the political climate towards Muslims and Islam in the U.S. impact upon Coptic-Muslim relations here and back in the homeland? Thank you.
Thank you, Candace. So I know you asked a lot of questions during this presentation. I feel the questions will be answered differently depending on the group you're speaking to.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're looking at this current group that we have here, us, we are first-generation Americans, second-generation Coptic Americans. I don't think we would write these signs,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
this specific group, right? We would spell them perfectly fine. but I think, on a more serious note, I don't think we would take it from that side.
Mm-hmm.
Coptic genocide, before we even write that, would look at numbers and we'll post statistics. You ask people from Minya who have either witnessed, have relatives, experienced it firsthand, and there is conviction to why they're writing such a sign.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll ask those that never experienced but are motivators towards writing these signs and will support these signs and financially or in whatever manner that is, and empower people to write these signs and go chanting, and they don't know what they're chanting about. So it's interesting because if we ask these questions to these three different groups, it's not going to be the same consistent response.
Yeah.
And how do we reconcile that? Because prior to my priesthood, there was always the slogan, squeaky wheel gets the oil. And for this group, these protesters, to chant the way they do and to constantly be at the forefront with a voice, quote unquote, that's the voice. That's the voice that's being heard right now, to some extent. Where if we're trying to look at it from a human rights perspective, I'm sure this current group that we're here, that is present with us today, can look at it from a human rights perspective, can reach out to the appropriate organizations that support human rights and say, well, this is our angle, versus, a sort of alienated community, a sort of religiously driven community that is oppressed, that is going through its own quote-unquote Holocaust, and then there's conflict between even these two groups, because then, one group is going to say, we could take it from this direction, and the other group will say, you'll never understand because you never even lived a day in Egypt. So how do we gear these questions, not necessarily to unite, but maybe to educate, but at the same time to unite the message appropriately?
Yeah.
Sorry, that was long-winded, but
No. I mean, I don't have an exact answer to it, but what I would say is, and let me make explicitly clear the reason that I went through this presentation the way that I did, is to not say that there are. The reason I went through this is because there's a way in which white America sees cops, right, as a cohesive whole. They could care less as to the generational differences. So when people see these type of signs and the kind of ways in which Coptic activism, whether it's from the 1970s and especially through the late 90s and until today, has been utilized by certain forces within like the US government for other aims. And so how does that measure up against the ways in which cops, as a Middle Eastern immigrant community in the United States, how does that measure up to their everyday kind of experiences, negative or positive, right? And so, yeah, I think that it's an important one in which even somebody like Shawty Karas, one of the kind of founders of Coptic activism, I mean, the founder of Coptic activism in the United States in the early 70s, but even before then, how he utilized at one point in time, particularly in the 80s, human rights discourse to advance kind of Coptic agenda. So if you look at his newsletters, the Cops, from that started in like the 70s, but especially gained steam through the 80s and the 90s. If you look at like their issues, there's a lot of kind of human rights language in what they're saying, but it's also intermixed with articles about the evils of Islam. And it's not to say that we should, critique Shawty or others for using that language, because they had their own experiences in Egypt that they were also kind of trying to deal with. But how is that read in English to other audiences, right? So there's a way in which like you navigate within your community kind of what cohesive message you want to put forward, but no community is ever cohesive, right? There's multiple layers, and how that is perceived by the outside. So within your group and outside of it. So that's what I would say, yeah.
I'm quite new to a lot of the history, and I didn't really, it sounds ridiculous, but I didn't, I was actually chatting with someone last week in church, and they were telling me about sort of the things that different members of the Catholic community have gone through since 9/11. And obviously, as a black person, I'm not strange to, state authority and police being hostile to you, but I was still shocked because I just didn't know. There was actually another question. There was actually a question I had after the statement, but I lost my train of thought.
Okay.
So I'll come back at another.
Okay. I do want to say, just to that point as well, that within the kind of academic literature, not only in academic literature, but in the United States in general, that there is a black-white binary, okay? Even in the early naturalization cases, it wasn't simply it was not simply about whiteness. It was that you were not black, right? So even in U.S. legal structures, there is a black-white binary. But what ends up happening, I would argue, is that after 1965, and particularly after 9/11, like with the kind of structural emergence of discriminatory measures against certain populations, for example, in the New York, New Jersey area with the NYPD surveillance program and other programs across the United States, there's a way in which like the black-white binary is important, but also troubled by this new kind of figure of the terrorist, right? So both of them interact with one another. They're both very important. But there's not a clear answer to it. It's just it complicates the kind of race questions like in the United States, right?
I remember after 9/11, the New York Times did an article, and they went around and they interviewed all these black guys. And the black guys were saying, talking about their experiences after 9/11, that basically the police stopped harassing them. And they stopped harassing them, and they stopped, these sort of hostile, problematic relations, because basically kind of the white cop structure had kind of a new boogeyman, which was the Muslim or the Islamic-looking person. Yeah, and I found that very, very strange when I read it.
Mm-hmm.
But I could understand how that happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Also to say that, many folks, even black folks in the United States, and there's many academics of anti-Muslim racism who have talked about this, even black folks had inclinations towards Islamophobia as well. I mean, even Latinx folks as well, right? There's not a way that other immigrant communities or other communities of color that have also been targeted by kind of U.S. Security structures did not also fall prey to these new iterations of the boogeyman. Right?
Oh, I agree with that.
Yeah.
So you spoke about how Lebanese or Syrian Christians were appealing to religion to forge alliances with white Americans. And I wonder why that sort of campaign for acceptance and assimilation happened post 9/11 for the Copts, and why it didn't begin earlier, such that when 9/11 happened, we wouldn't have been seen as a threat at all.
Well, I mean, so I'll say two things. The first is that, Cops have been on the kind of Washington, D.C. lobbying scene for a number of years because of the efforts of this person, Shawqi Qaras, who, kind of spearheaded the efforts to get Pope Shenouda out of monastery arrest. Somebody who campaigned President Carter to write a letter to Hosni Mubarak to get Pope Shenouda out. So it's not as if Washington, D.C. didn't know who, the cops were. It's just that obviously after 9/11, finding the victims of Islamic terrorism became a major strategy point. And one of the kind of most paradoxical and most, emotion-inducing kind of images are those of Copts and other Middle Eastern Christians, right? Like those Christians that live right next to, Muslims in predominantly Muslim countries. But what I would say, and I guess push back against your question, is that a number of the people that I pointed to say, well, but I'm not the Muslim, I'm Christian. And that still doesn't matter, right? So if we go back to Romani's case, okay? Literally in the Museum of the Bible, there are sections that are about Copts, right? There's Coptic texts. He was with a church group. So I'm going to assume that there might have been a priest there. I'm just going to assume, maybe. And so even in explaining, well, I'm Christian, I'm not Muslim, there's a way in which that doesn't even matter. There's certain markers of suspicion that go beyond the level of intelligibility, in saying oh no, now I get you're a Christian, I'm not gonna discriminate against you, right? Because it's not necessarily about, oh, this is the fact. It's about how certain people are netted in racially into this system, right? So even the gas station owner, he was a Christian. The FBI knew that. It didn't matter though, because he looked Middle Eastern. Actually, at the end of an interview, because that case has actually been reported on in the news way back when, in 2001. The gas station owner's like, yeah, I mean, it's really hard to tell us apart. Like, as Middle Eastern, communities, it's hard to tell us apart. So it's not about, pointing out what the fact is, but it's about showing how the system actually works beyond facts. It's how are people identified racially in the U.S.?
I just find it so interesting that even when they say they're Christians, it seems not to make a difference. I mean, not that Muslims should be persecuted that way either, but I just find it's just so strange.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me think, a lot of the white supremacy thing is quite irrational. It's not a rational sort of belief
Right.
system.
Yeah.
And even in terms of, the white evangelical kind of thing. So you're in this Bible museum, and it's sort of kind of a white evangelical operation. And then they didn't even educate themselves enough to learn that while you have, foreign Christian groups from Egypt and from the East that come. Their origin is foreign. But frankly, to me, as a black person, it's like just business as usual.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Because the white supremacy as a belief system is built into American evangelical Christianity. And you can't, sort of there's no white evangelical Christianity outside of the white supremacy because the two go together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just because of the belief system of the individual people, it's sort of the intellectual development of that branch of Christianity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very true. I'm not an expert on this, but just to kind of point out there the ways in which, white Protestants, because the evangelical movement is a rather new one in after the 1950s, particularly in the 60s and 70s. Well, white Protestants, we can say, definitely upheld the system of slavery in the United States, right? That was, and they biblically reasoned why it was important to uphold that system. And while that doesn't seem like it should be important to you guys, it is important because that is the foundation of the U.S. economic and political system, right? I mean, in the Constitution, right? Think about how representation was allocated in the South, right? Based on how many slaves that you owned. And so when we think about that in relation to how cops are racialized in the United States, there's a way in which that also factors, right? That you are lesser a person and you can be the target of U.S. government policies because you could be a possible threat to our system, right? To our kind of not only racial system, but the foundations of American nationalism, right? So, yeah, thank you for that comment.
So one thing to share, you talked about difficulty flying. So I travel a lot for work, and I find it's all they either check my bag or the person in front of me's bag or the person behind me's bag. It's 1 out of 3 chance that they're going to check someone's, or it's going to be my bag they're checking. But I found that it's strange because if I'm dressed professionally, I almost get checked more often than if I'm dressed in like street clothes, like a hoodie or whatever, because it's all they're putting a lot of different biases, not just race but culture as well, on people, and it's comical, but I almost say that I accept it, because if they're not checking people who look like me, then they're not checking the people who are the bad guys. And I know that's a really very heavy thing to say, but I generally understand there's a lot of need for education. One thing that we talked about, and I think there's going to be a lot of efforts within the church as a Global Coptic Day. I wanted to get your thoughts on Global Coptic Day. What can we do around Global Coptic Day to help increase awareness of who we are as a people? What can we do around Global Coptic Day to increase awareness and should we at all talk about what goes on back in our home country? And what should we talk about, and really, what should we focus on from an anthropological standpoint and from a cultural standpoint, like as we start to now establish an identity outward facing?
Well, I think that's for Coptic folk to totally decide. What I can say is, what from the literature, how have academics studied Copts? And that maybe can give you an indication as to where non-Coptic people, I mean, there's some Coptic like anthropologists now and historians that are, redefining how Copts are understood, right? Because listen, if you're gonna read anything on the Coptic Church from the early 20th century, it's going to be real hard to find texts written by white people that don't talk about the Coptic Church as a heretical church, as, a monophysite church, and all of these kind of derogatory things that Copts, really loathe, right? So when you have people from the community that are actually talking about the community, things are going to be seen differently. From the kind of most recent literature, what has been focused on is still the kind of, and it was spoken about today during Magadate's funeral, is that Coptic suffering is something that is central to Coptic identity, right? That it's not just the evangelicals that came up with this idea of the persecuted church narrative in the late 80s, early 90s, that became kind of a unifier of all Christians, eventually became a unifier of all Christians globally. Copts also have their own history of what a persecuted church means and looks like. And so it's really just thinking about how I think Copts want to advance their identity as a living one, as a living, breathing one that's not just about death, but also about life. And obviously, there's, after many of these terrorist attacks that have happened in Egypt over the past few years, there has been, a discourse about let's talk about the lives that we lead to, not just us in death. And so what that also means is that Coptic identity might have to go beyond the Coptic Orthodox Church as well, right? That Copts are doing a lot of different things that don't just fall under the purview of the institutional authority of the Coptic Church. And so, for example, we might be able to learn as Coptic Orthodox and Copts from Egypt and now in diaspora. We might be able to learn from other Middle Eastern Christian communities, like the Assyrians, for example, who I'm just getting to learn more about. But many of them have civil societies and historical associations. What would it be to think about Coptic identity through Coptic civilization? As Michael Saad, if he's going to watch this in Los Angeles, California, on Logos Television, who has his series, Coptic Civilization. Everybody should look it up on YouTube. He really brings to the fore what Coptic identity is beyond just death and persecution. And so that's maybe one way to think about Global Coptic Day that's just beyond focusing on persecution and maybe towards Coptic art, Coptic modern and ancient, Coptic music, right? Modern and ancient, and a bunch of other things. That's just my humble opinion as somebody who is not ethnically Coptic, but is a lover of Coptic art and history as well. I don't know who has the mic.
I had two questions, but it seems like American Muslims see the Coptic persecution very skeptical.
Mm-hmm.
might be a little obvious, but can you touch on why, like how they see our persecution and why, you know, they kind of don't see, I guess, what we see?
Sure.
And then I guess the other thing is, can you touch on why these evangelical Protestants see us as heretical?
Okay. I mean, actually, maybe that's an easier question for me to answer, but okay, I'll answer the first one. So I don't want to say like all, I mean, when you say American Muslims, like it's just as complicated as Abuna's question of like, what Copts are we talking about with these signs, right? Like different generations, different places that they're coming from, like all of these things matter. So when I can specifically talk about why maybe Egyptian Muslims, some Egyptian Muslims in the United States that are maybe more associated with, how can I say this in the most pleasant of ways, are more conservative, let's say, come from a more conservative religious background. But I've also heard this from some more elite folk that are academics in the U.S., that Copts aren't really persecuted in Egypt, right? From the first perspective, so kind of more religiously conservative Egyptian Muslim folk that are in the U.S., I've heard this, I'm just saying this is an example, that, you know, actually Islamists in Egypt are more persecuted than Copts, right? That they are, you know, arrested. They are political dissidents, which is very true. It is also very true. Like, not all Islamists are, you know, blowing churches up. Not all Islamists are engaging in violence against Christians, right? There's layers to the Islamist movement in Egypt. And so when they have their family members rounded up and, you know, sent to prison, or they don't even know where they are, tortured to death, etc., they, in many ways, see a disconnect between that experience and what they see as preferential preferential treatment by the Egyptian government, in the sense that, for example, President Sisi, like, building a cathedral for Copts, right? That there are ways in which Copts are praised by the Egyptian government, right? So that's the way in which they see it. They don't see, you know, Copts as political activists that are jailed and tortured. Up until recently, when we actually do have a few Coptic activists that are now in jail under the Sisi government, including a close friend of mine, Rami Kamil, who is somebody who has fought for Coptic rights in Egypt for most of his adult life and is languishing in prison at the moment, and has been tortured, etc. There's a way in which Islamists that have experienced generations of arrests and all these things don't have the same kind of eye towards what Coptic suffering is like as a minority community. They see themselves as a minority, a political minority that is targeted by the government, right? So there's almost a disconnect because they're not interacting with Copts, even when they come to the United States, right? There's a way in which, like, Egyptian Christians and Muslims in the U.S. context, and this is at least from my experience, do not interact with each other unless they go out of their way to do so. So it depends on the generations, I would say, right? If you're more involved in Egyptian politics, you might be a part of some kind of Christian Muslim organizations in the New York, New Jersey area, for example. But if you're a part of the second generation, I mean, for those that are part of the second generation here, are you going to Egyptian organizations where Egyptian Muslims and Christians go to? Maybe I'm wrong here, but at least from my research experience, there was a kind of generational disconnect. So that's what I would say, is that they have the experience that they're a minority community, not Copts. And the second, why evangelicals think that Copts are heretical, how do you even answer this? Well, Protestants, for a number of years, I mean, Catholics were the ire of Protestants in the 1950s, for example. Like, there's a lot of political cartoons, not even just political cartoons, like, they're very serious caricatures of Irish being not true Americans because they take their Irish and Italians not being true Americans because they take their orders from the Pope, and so they can be true Americans because they have a higher ruler than the American government. So obviously Protestants are going to see Copts as heretical because there's a Pope, because we believe in the sacraments, just a number of reasons, right? Evangelicals and other Protestants, I mean, it depends on which Protestants we're talking about. We're talking about Anglicans. I mean, Anglicans and evangelicals, totally different. But they see us as heretical because we're just not Protestant, you know? That's the long and the short of it, yeah.
I think some of it, I don't necessarily ascribe to these things, but you asked me. Some of it is that Protestantism what came about in opposition. Protestantism came about in opposition to Catholicism. And so the extent to which there's an overlap between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, Orthodoxy falls under the same critique. So that's kind of, I think, yeah. So that's kind of why it's considered heretical. So some aspects are considered heretical.
Okay, I see your hand also. Yeah.
Maybe not all of us were referred to the FBI by a security guard, but many of us probably were stopped by a cop, and we kind of got a taste of what being profiled is. So has your research, because we have to answer these questions, has your research shown you why do Coptic people tend to embrace conservative politics or the right? Although I'm not saying that that's the only party that embraces or promotes racism, but in this election year, it's pretty obvious that the Republican Party is where a lot of this racial tensions happen. So do you know why, or have you seen anything in your research to indicate that why do we tend to embrace our potential oppressors?
Okay, well, I think that there's racism in both political parties, but just because like it's racism light and like racism in your face doesn't mean it doesn't affect people the same way, you know? So I would say though that this is actually you hit on like a major problem in terms of thinking about the ways that Coptic lobbying goes in Washington, D.C., or even like any Middle Eastern Christian lobbying in Washington, D.C. goes. Because, I mean, the long and the short of it, we can say that there is this push on kind of in liberal politics and like leftists, like let's say the Democratic Party, et cetera, away from kind of culture war issues, away from embracing kind of Christianity as like a national identity. That obviously happens in the 1980s, especially with like the eruption of the culture wars. And you see that the Republican Party becomes sutured to these key questions. Well, I mean, first and foremost, one of the big ones being on abortion, right? And so as Christians, Copts are very much, and as conservative Christians, let's say some or maybe the majority of Copts being so, find that particular kind of culture war politics to be attractive, right? Because it also connects to kind of moral understandings that are learned within our churches, right? And so there is a way though that this question like goes beyond the bounds of what Copts want and what they don't want, and goes more into kind of left-right politics in the United States and the embrace of Christianity as like a national identity amongst those in the right, and the distancing from those in the left from the kind of Christian identification. And so what ends up happening there is you have more kind of right-wing, let's say, quote-unquote, politics that gravitates towards, you know, Christians that want to actively address their moral needs in American society. And so when you have maybe leftist cops that don't ascribe to all of these kind of moral questions or the kind of adjudication of like, this is what the Republican Party believes on these particular issues and this is what the Democratic Party believes on these particular issues. There's a way that the Coptic question and addressing Coptic suffering in Egypt becomes sutured to these right-wing politics. There's no way to adjudicate it outside of those right-wing politics because Democratic politicians, for the most part, depending on what constituency they have, because I've seen many Democrats that have supported Coptic issues because they have high numbers of Copts that live in their districts, so like let's say Southern California or other places. But for the most part, even those that don't have any Copts living in their district take on the Coptic cause because of this existential question within American politics between kind of a Christian morality and a secularist, leftist understanding of where we should go in this country. So one of the key people that I can reference, and I'm sure there's some YouTube video on him talking about this, is Louis Gohmert, congressman from Texas. Love watching this guy talk. I mean, what an orator. But I've seen him a number of times like talk about Copts and connect the suffering of Copts and the politics in Egypt to a wider kind of Armageddon framing, right? An evangelical kind of Armageddon framing. And so it's not as if we can kind of separate American evangelicals from like US politicians. Over the past 30 years, they have become, in many cases, they have become melded into one another. So it's a hard question because politicians on the left don't necessarily care to talk about Christians in the Middle East that are having a hard time of late because that question has been sutured to right-wing politics, right? So it's kind of a catch-22 that Copts find themselves in the U.S., right? In wanting to demand greater rights for their brethren back in Egypt, they also have to play the game with these kind of nefarious figures as well.
The follow-up question is, have you noticed why in Egypt sometimes they tend to ignore that sometimes their leader is Muslim and think of him more as the security guy? Like, how do they manage that perception of their leaders in Egypt then, if there are no political ideology in Egypt, as we know?
Are you saying Copts in Egypt?
Yeah.
And because Sisi is like a Muslim, like they don't, okay. Well, again. Or Hosni Mubarak, yeah, okay. We can actually think about the difference between Sisi and Sadat, okay? So both these dudes, Muslim, right? But there's a way in which when Copts maybe in the U.S. read what's happening in Egypt, they're like, yeah, like they're all Muslims, like Muslim Brotherhood Muslims, Sisi Muslim, like the same. No, obviously in the Egyptian context, right, there is a difference between more secular Muslims and, even more towards the atheist Muslims and those within the government that are Muslim and those that are Islamists, right? Because since the 1970s, Islamists have been politicized in Egypt for having a particular appearance, right? The beard, so obviously the beard has a different connotation in Egypt than it does in the US, right? There's a mixing together almost of these different experiences. So, for example, maybe less so now because the hipster movement has really made the beard cool. But how many times have Coptic male folks gotten the talking to about having a beard by people in their communities, and it's not here, and not just here, but maybe people visiting from Egypt saying why do you look Muslim, right? That was one story that somebody told to me. And so there's obviously two different contexts, but they're coming together in very unique ways. So in the Egyptian context, like Islamists have a very colored appearance on the Egyptian political stage, and Sisi is just not an Islamist. So it's a different relationality than Mohammed Morsi, okay? Mohammed Morsi being associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, not the protector of Copts in Egypt, right? But Sisi not being associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, yes, okay, protector, right?
But the only gauge that they determine how, light or intense a potential political leader is whether or not churches will be destroyed and Copts will be, persecuted. But they never hold to account the moderate centrist Muslims who improve on any of the injustice. They only curve it against what destructions that might not befall them, as opposed to what improvements that they can get. So you don't, have you seen anything as to why they only limit their
Okay, I see what you're saying. Look, I don't think that the long and the short of it, I don't think that there's an exact answer to this question because, well, one, I think it depends regionally. Like, are the Copts of, Minya, that are in some of these, very high-risk areas thinking, the same way about these issues that, Copts in Heliopolis are? Probably not. I think that there's class dynamics to this. I think that there's regional dynamics to this. And so in many ways, you have Copts in Alexandria and especially Cairo that probably view Copts in Upper Egypt just as exotically as maybe some Copts in the United States do, right? So it depends on who we're talking about, what regions and classes we're talking about when we say those that are supporting the government. And I think that is actually less and less likely across the board in general because of the direction that Egypt is going socioeconomically. But I would just say that. I mean, there's no answer that you can give because it just depends on the context.
I've never seen our number in the States as Copts as being such a great number, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm guessing, I don't know if you know how many we are.
You know what? Nobody
There's a
knows.
guesstimate. There's a guesstimate in Jersey, it's 25,000.
Sure. But that's dependent on church records, right?
Right.
So it's dependent upon who's registered at different churches.
Mhm.
There's a lot of Copts that are not.
So a number like that in the state of New Jersey, how effective is that in the census?
Good question. Um,
And same with New York. I think New York maybe 10 to 15,000.
I think, the entire diocese, you're right, maybe 10 to 15,000 then in New York. Because the entire diocese of New York and New England is the same. Okay, that's a good question. So obviously, I don't know if people have seen the emails and all these things that social media posts that have been going around, that the Coptic Church is in the United States, is especially in the New York, New Jersey area, is pushing forward that Copts should check other in the race category instead of white, because all Middle Eastern communities are considered to be white because of the history that I went over for the Syrian and Lebanese populations, are considered to be white. And so in order for Copts, Egyptians, to get more recognition, there is going to be you guys have the option to mark other and put Egyptian, right? What is that going to do? Well, there's a number of different communities that do this because they believe that this will make their numbers more apparent for representation purposes. We can also say that it's more of a political act, against the current system more than anything, because even if you check other and you put in Egyptian, it's not going to make any kind of demographic difference in terms of like, marking for representation or where like certain resources should be allocated. That may change in the future. I think that this is like let's try this out now because this happens every 10 years. So let's see what we got for now. But you do have like many other initiatives that are the same that operated off this same logic. Like in LA in 2010, I think it was in 2000 and 2010 that the diocese said you should check other and put Coptic for greater representation. Who knows if it's going to have a difference? But given that other Middle Eastern communities also do similar things, like they don't have an institution like the Coptic Orthodox Church that is telling them to do this or that. Maybe some of them do, but it doesn't translate into like resource allocation. So it's really a symbolic act, right? And so like, what is this saying about the decision to mark Egyptian and not Coptic, for example? Because is Egyptian a race? Question mark. Sure. That's a contemporary Egyptian political argument.
Population of, there you have 10,000 Coptic and 5,000 Egyptian, as opposed to 15,000 Coptic Egyptian.
Sure. I mean, this is the reason why there's not an accurate number of how many Copts are in the United States, because, well, one, there's a way in which like even church figures are not going to measure up to like how many people there actually are. There's a way in which the US government also doesn't make statistics based off of religious basis. So if they're going to do, for example, like the last, I think, statistics in terms of migration for Egyptian migration was done in 2015 or 2017. I'm going to say 2015. May 2015, the Migration Policy Institute came out with statistics in terms of like how many people have applied for asylum, how many people have applied for the green card lottery or here, family reunification, all these things. But that doesn't say much that doesn't tell us much as like a church community or like as for the Coptic community, right? Because there's still not the difference. And even so, Princeton at the National Immigrant Survey, they have determined, and this is what Pew Research is actually using, which is a little bit iffy. They're saying that up to 75% of the Egyptian population in the U.S. is Christian. Okay, somewhere between like 61 and 75%, because there's a margin of error, and there's also some people who identify with no religion. And that's what Pew Research is using as their statistic, right? But the underlying data for this, which I found out, is very kind of haphazard. That the last statistics were collected before 2011. So imagine like what the statistics are after the kind of population explosion, like that came after the revolution. And so I don't think that there's going to be an accurate way to do these things because religion is not a basis for data collection in the U.S. Races. So that's a question that the community has to decide, and for at least the 2020 census, it's been decided.
So, given
For the gram.
Okay. Given your, all the research that you presented, everything from like anecdotes to your own specific cultural immersion that you presented, and how you've been talking about whether it's been the awareness or the control of the narrative that's been primarily rooted in persecution. What do you think right now, is that the right narrative? Or what do you think the narrative should be in terms of repositioning or redefining how the identity structure is? And on that note, in order to, gain more, whether it's recognition or awareness or resource allocation, what is sort of, is that the right narrative? And what's the right opportunity to reposition that narrative or redefine it to gain, the resource allocation, recognition, advocacy that the community sort of desires?
Well, I mean, I guess there's just like even more questions. Like, first, what are the aims of the diaspora in help? Like, what is defined as helping Copts back in Egypt? Like, what does that actually mean on the ground? And admittedly, like Coptic NGOs, like Coptic Orphans, like are doing things that help in kind of like at the micro level, right? Connecting like those in the diaspora back to Egypt, or like kind of financial sponsoring and things like that. And I think that in many ways, like those initiatives are sometimes more helpful in actually creating change on the ground, like that you're educating or you're instilling in these Coptic students that you have, these Christian students you have, like a desire to, get further education, to especially the girls that are part of these programs. And there's less of a chance of you falling into kind of a catch-22. When it comes to foreign policy advocacy, because like it's different than like local politics, right? In the New York, New Jersey area, there are, there's this new American Coptic Council. I think that's American Coptic Council, yeah. Kind of the offspring of the American Coptic Association, which was started by Shawi Karos in like the early 70s. So the American Coptic Council is meeting with politicians to say like, this is who we are. These are the needs of like the local community. Let's hear more about like, what are you doing for the coronavirus? Like, prevention, like preventing it from spreading, et cetera. Like, so talking about kind of local issues that affect the communities here. This is what I've seen from this new organization. There's a difference between them that are doing kind of more localized efforts at the community level, and there's less of maybe a catch-22 that they could fall in, because they're literally just trying to like talk about kind of issues related to the immediate problems that some of their like communities in the New York, New Jersey area face. But when you go to like the national level, there's actually somebody who's focusing on this paradox, this issue in her research, Murray Phillippos, and she is part of the Coptic Canadian History Project. She's looking at the ways in which Copts are engaged in and utilized by the religious freedom movement in the United States, like the International Religious Freedom Agenda. And I mean, she can probably speak more to this based off of her research, but what I can say is that there is a catch-22 that Copts fall into. And also I'm asked this question in terms of like, right and left politics. If Copts are not legible to the left, but are legible to the right, obviously as lobbyists, where are you gonna go for the policies, I guess, you wanna pass? But it's also questionable to me personally, while much of my research wasn't focused there, what those policies are actually doing for everyday Copts like on the ground, right? If you have Coptic activists that are pushing for, let's say, legislation to help with church construction in Egypt, to make military aid, Egypt's second largest recipient of US military aid, in the billions of dollars, make that aid conditional upon Coptic equality, like passing, Coptic church or reconstruction or construction legislation in Egypt. You're not going to get your military aid until you do these things. There's a way in which Shawi Karos and others in the 1970s saw this play out, is that Copts in the diaspora are viewed as a threat to the Egyptian government. And so in many ways, the Egyptian government doesn't see a disconnect between Copts in Egypt and Copts in the diaspora. And you can see this very, very clearly when we have our beloved bishops come and visit from Egypt every September during the General Assembly, trying to get people on buses to go support President Sisi. Because there's a way in which that matters to how it's viewed back in Egypt. So when you have Copts that are advancing other things that maybe criticize the Egyptian government, whether it's President Sadat in the 1970s that led to the house arrest of our, beloved Pope Shenouda. Or today, in which when the 21 martyrs of Libya were martyred, when ISIS released like their monthly magazine or whatever, talking about why they did what they did, they noted that the Coptic Church was a crusader church. Okay, very weird framing, because the Coptic Church, Copts in general, were the targets of crusaders from Europe. One of the last crusades targeted Egypt. I think the last crusade targeted Egypt. And so in saying that the Coptic Orthodox Church is a crusader church, it speaks to the ways in which Copts throughout modern history of Egypt have been viewed as foreign entities, as identifying with Western Christianity. Even before the 1952 revolution, there were 3 Coptic men who were burned alive inside of a church in Port Said, because, and Shawi Karas talks about this in his book, were burned alive in a church because the local Muslim Brotherhood thought that Copts were collaborating with the British colonial officers who were fighting different Islamists in Port Said at that time. And so even if they weren't collaborating with the British and were actually actively fighting against the British colonial regime, they were still identified with them because of their shared Christianity. So this is the paradox of the Copts, right? That they are both indigenous Christians to the region, but because of the legacies of Christian colonialism in the region and the ways that it affected greatly different Muslim and Christian populations there, they're almost sutured to this Western identification. So when Copts lobby Washington, D.C. for changes in Egypt, that history comes up again in many ways.
That's help us, because we need help to look at how we have contributed over the years. So it's sort of shifting the helplessness to the contribution side. But
Sure.
yeah, it's just like reframing it. And I just wonder if we're so stuck in this helplessness narrative that positions us as almost like, not a hand-me-out, but doesn't give a lot of credit to all the accomplishments over the years that have been buried in this narrative of help, help, help. Not that we are to forget that, but I think, right now we're at a point where it's like an inflection point, right? Where the awareness is high, there is lobbying to see the funds are there, so there is a way to sort of reposition things. And that to me has, just me personally, has stronger, more positive appeal and a forward-looking sort of positioning than a just help us.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with you, and that's why, the Coptic Civilization show on Logos TV, sorry, I'm plugging it again, it is really a beautiful show because it shows the kind of the unique ways in which Copts have contributed to world civilization. But I would say, though, that it's not how can I make this argument? There's a way in which Coptic accomplishments are, I guess, the framing of Coptic accomplishments is challenged by the system itself. And there's many ways in which Magid Ataya talked about this with me personally and in his blogs, Salam Musa, where the Copts find themselves in, very precarious positions to get, attention in DC. There's a way that precarity and suffering are used, to garner attention. And it's not to say that, the different communities that do so, like Middle Eastern Christian communities, are not doing so, disingenuously. There are serious problems. But it's also the way in which, things must be framed in the DC framework. in order to be listened to be read. And so that is like the major issue. It's not necessarily like, okay, let's talk about Coptic accomplishments and why that is the reason that they should help us in Egypt. Because I guess I would argue that the U.S. government and, I mean, European governments historically have not focused on those things, right? Saving Middle Eastern Christians is not a new framing. You know, the British did that, French did that. And so it's a part of the systematic failure to think about communities in the Middle East beyond saving or punishing. That's what I would say.
I had a thought about the framing, you know, the left versus right kind of thing. The truth is that there are tons of Christians in the Democratic Party.
Sure.
It's just that they're not white. They're all black and Hispanic. And the pastor on TV that said that if you're a black person in America, it's like a really, really high chance that you're going to be a Democrat. But that doesn't mean you're a liberal. So because race is the way everything is divided in this country, you have tons of super culturally conservative blacks and Hispanics saved who are just in the Democratic Party. And I think that see, if you see the white evangelicals, because they're hooked up with the politicians, they're the ones that have the power. So even if, because I can tell you, black Christians relate, like I relate completely, because our experience is one of oppression for the last 500 years. So you don't have to make a powerful argument to me about, you know, things that go on in Egypt and all this kind of stuff. We get it. However, we don't have any power, so what's the point of making an alliance? I think that the making an alliance with the right, it's almost like kind of going with the strong horse. Yeah. And it's on one level, it's sensible.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that you're also alluding to the fact that there are also economic alliances that are within these parties too. So if we think about immigrant communities that maybe engage more Republican politics because as doctors and lawyers and whatever else, they've have been able to be successful in the United States, achieve the American dream. And those particular economic politics also speak to them as well. And so that's all, I think that's also a factor, but you alluded to that too, so. Right. Right. No, that's, yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, okay. There was like one more question maybe from yeah, there was one more question. Sorry, I just want to. I want to hear some more feedback from some women because just talked to all dudes in my research, so really nice to hear from some women.
So I guess the first thing I was wondering was why that was the case,
Sure.
and two, just from maybe your perspective, what are some of the remarks or observations you've made on women? And like, we're happy to answer them. I know you gave us a bunch of questions. I think we have to see them all and think about them a little more, but I was just wondering what you could share with us.
Yeah, that's my weak spot, and sincerely appreciate that question because I think as I look towards doing rewrites for the book and doing further research, it's something that I definitely need to address. Why that happened? Well, it's not to say that I haven't engaged with women like in my work. I mean, the only reason that I was able to go to Bahgura, for example, is because I did a Serve to Learn program, like through Coptic Orphans. Coptic Orphans is very dominantly run by great women. And so that's awesome. But in terms of access points, whether here or in Egypt, a lot of the access that I've been given is through the clerical hierarchy. So bishops are men, priests are men. And so the political questions that I had both in Egypt in my previous research and in the US, I mean, even though the president of the American Coptic Council right now is a woman, which is great. Oh my gosh, wonderful. I'm sorry, I mean, wonderful, great. Historically, it's been mostly men. So when I'm doing oral interviews with people that are associated with the American Coptic Association, all men. And so there's a structural reason why this happened. I had to go out of my way, I think, to do research like amongst Coptic women. So even let's talk about liturgy.
Mm-hmm.
How many like Coptic women are really consumed in child caring, in child rearing, like during liturgical services or even after, or like cooking or cleaning like the church, etc. Like all of these very laborious things that don't give women a lot of time to think about political questions. It's not to say that they're not, that's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying structurally how I was able to, speak about certain political issues or race or a number of these questions was through Coptic male contacts. Again, yes, definitely a fault of mine that I need to remedy in the coming years. But structurally, that's just how it came about. Even, I spent some time with some vendors in New York, like working those food carts, working those, halal kebab stands. Are any of those people Coptic women? No.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe my dear friend Besma, who knows many of these folks, could say differently, but most of them are Coptic men. So hanging out with them, hearing about their immigration histories, very male-focused. Or even Coptic asylum seekers. Not to say that there weren't women that I interacted with. Many of the Coptic asylum seekers after 2011 were single men. So structurally, that's just how things operated, and it pains my heart because the women that I interacted with during my research are some of the strongest women I've ever met in my entire life, because they have to uphold a household and work and get things done so their partners can have the freedom to think about political matters. But it's also a structural thing that I definitely need to remedy. So my apologies to
No,
my
thank
Coptic
you.
Orthodox sisters.
I think that I was just wondering why, and I had a feeling that was it. And it's interesting to hear that too, because I think that women in the Coptic Church have changed significantly over the years, and that I don't know, maybe back in the day, I just know studied a lot on women in the Coptic history in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, and back then they stayed at home and prayed for their husbands. St. John Chrysostom talks about that, and so that's not the case anymore, obviously. But I was just wondering if there was more political opinions or anything of that sort. But I guess we'd have to explore that.
There's definitely a lot of
Yeah.
political opinions, by the way. That I think that I, even as a woman, am biased against women. I can be the first to admit that, because that's just. I think there was I don't believe any of these studies, but there was this study that's been going around after Elizabeth Warren dropped out that's saying that 90% of women are biased against other women, right? But that's actually very true, because I have talked to many women in my research that have particular politics that you know, even while we're eating the dinner the lunch that they just made for the family together, they tell me experiences that they have at work, or, you know, what they see that's going on in Egypt, how they feel about it. But they're not a part of the political organizations that I followed, or even, you know, even some of the Coptic activists like in DC that are a part of this like older generation, mostly men. So there's that, definitely my own bias as well.
Thank you.
Anything else? Yeah. Oh, yes. Thank you. So Monday, the reason I'm in town, I organized a panel at Fordham University, so like the Lincoln Center campus, on thinking about orthodoxy and anthropology, and from both Eastern and Oriental Orthodox perspectives. And we're going to have some folks that focus on Copts, focus on Orthodox women in Finland, Russian and Ethiopian Orthodox women. It's an all-female panel. And so come out if you want some information. Please come up to me after, and I'll let you know where it's at and all the details. But please come if you can.
So I just wanted to thank Candace again. As you know, Candace comes strictly from an anthropologic perspective. So when we're listening to her, coming from that angle, you're going to hear things that may offend you, right? Because she's telling you your own, you know, the things that you do naturally that may be offensive to other humans like you. Right? I mean, in essence, pretty much. But at the same time, it's based on academic statistics. It's based on record. It's based on actions that have been taken. And it's always a beautiful, enlightening thing, because sometimes when we hear our own mistakes, we are so ashamed of them that we don't even want to own up to them. And it's throughout the whole talk, I'm thinking, so how does, you know, everything that we just discussed, how does it parallel what the gospel tells us as Christians, right? Because it's one thing to be ethnic, but it's another thing to be faithfully identifying in Christianity, in Christ, and loving your neighbor, and loving, you know, your neighbor is not just the Copt that's like you, it's the neighbor that is unlike you. But what we have in common is our own humanity with one another. So it's always important to listen to such things, especially when it's someone who does the research, in order to learn more about ourselves, in order to work on ourselves to be a better people. Thank you, Candace, for this great talk, and we pray for you that you continue to thrive in your career and in your studies, and now with the Assyrians, I believe, right? Which is, she was actually supposed to go to Iraq, and it got canceled because of Corona. So Corona is really affecting us. It's really cramping our style these days. Please stand up for prayer. After we pray, we're going to go upstairs for Vespers. We're delayed with Vespers, but we're going to start Vespers right away. God bless you all for coming tonight. Tomorrow, we will be having liturgy. Just a reminder, we are losing 1 hour of sleep tonight. We are springing forward 1 hour. I kind of feel good telling you this. I don't know why. The reaction was bar none. It was amazing. We're losing 1 hour of sleep 1 hour earlier, so you don't lose it. But liturgy tomorrow, 8:45. Matins, 8:45. Liturgy, 9:15 a.m., followed by brunch. We do have relics for Pope Carlos upstairs. We will have a special Vesper service tomorrow at 6 p.m., where we will beautify the relics of Pope Carlos tomorrow. We also have a special item that is coming. It's also considered a relic. I believe it's considered a third-degree relic, which is one of the hoods that Pope Kyrillos used to wear with his cape. And so that's going to be a great blessing for us. But right now we do have a first-degree relic of Pope Kyrillos, which is part of his body, which is I think the hair. And then we start the Lenten lecture series tomorrow at 1 p.m. So again, I encourage you to come. The Lenten lecture series is going to be a 5-part series on apologetics. And tomorrow we will welcome Bishoy Yaub. Bishoy Yaub is very learned when it comes to the apologetics. He comes from an attorney's perspective, so he comes with a lot of research and a lot of great delivery. And what is the topic for tomorrow's lecture? Okay, does God exist or does he not exist? And again, apologetics is proving without necessarily biblical references in order so that, because not everyone uses the Bible as their litmus or as their truth that are not Christian. So it's important for us to understand, even from just a logical perspective, these truths. God bless you all, and we will pray and then proceed to Vespers. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. O Lord, make us worthy to pray thankfully. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. In Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. You may go in peace. The peace of the Lord be with you all.